There was a game that we played in the schoolyard as I was growing up, and I don't know if they still play this game or not because it's not really culturally appropriate. I don't think it's not politically correct, whatever phrase you want to call it. But there's a game called Cooties. You remember this game? Girls have cooties, boys have cooties, like, right? Yeah, all the things. And the deal was the opposite gender had cooties, and you couldn't touch them. And if you touched them or if they touched you, then you had the cooties. Do they still play this today? No? We're way too advanced for that, aren't we? The game actually, though, has really very real roots. In World War I, soldiers were getting body lice and were being bitten in the trenches during World War I, and the soldiers began to call it cooties. They have the cooties. And as we do in the West, we decided to make light of it, and we're like, let's call a game called Cooties. And so we had this game, and some of you have been traumatized by this very game because you had cooties every time you went to recess. But the only way for this game for you to be immune from this game, this viral disease, was to receive a shot. And there had to be a game member that had a pin, and you would run up to them, and they would grab your arm, and they would say, circle, now. It's coming back to some of you now, right? You're like, oh, yes, I remember now. Now I got to teach my kids, and my teachers are going to hate them. Circle, now. You have your cootie shot. And now that I think about it, all of this sounds like 2020. Now, you probably did not have cooties on your bingo card for my sermon today, I would imagine. But today in the passage that we're going to be in Mark chapter 1, we're going to hear the story of the leper having this encounter with the Messiah, Jesus, the rabbi. This encounter is something that is fascinating and is something that we would see it as like this cootie situation. You would not want to touch this person. You would not want to be near this person. They are contagious, and you can't be around them. This is the story that we're going to find in this passage. Mark chapter 1, verse 40 through 45 is where we're going to be this morning as we close out chapter 1. This is what it says. And a leper came to him, Jesus, imploring him and kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." And moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and he touched him and he said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priests and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but it was out in the desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Now Jesus is now in full swing of his ministry life. We've seen over the last couple of weeks as we've been walking through the story of Jesus, he's John the Baptist baptizes him. He proclaims who he is. He goes into the synagogue. He begins to preach. He casts out demons. He begins to heal people. He's going from town to town and having these encounters. His ministry is now in full swing, but there's also this hint of keeping things in the background just a little bit longer, like to not go full on into the ministry. For those of you that were with us from day one here at Collective, and I'm not talking about January 26th of 2020, I'm talking about October of 2019, you were with us with what we call the soft launch phase of our church. This idea that we're doing ministry, but we're not officially kind of launched into the public yet. This is kind of what's happening with Jesus here, still in the background. So let's look at verse 40. And a leper came to him, imploring him and kneeling to him and said, "If you will, you can make me clean." Now we read this passage, and on the surface, it doesn't really capture how provocative this story really is. This is one of those stories that if you just kind of read through it, you're like, yeah, it sounds great. Jesus heals this leper and move on. But there's so many dynamics that are happening in the middle of this story that will bring some context to us. So this would be like front page news of the newspaper if we still did newspapers. Do we still do newspapers? Some. This would be trending on X. and I feel like a very old person trying to sound cool saying X instead of Twitter. It would be on your story. It would be shared by all of the influencers, right? Like a leper has close encounter with the rabbi. That would be the title of the news story. Now, leprosy was kind of this catch-all for a skin disease. When we think of leprosy, at least for me growing up, I thought it was like a specific thing like, oh, don't get leprosy. But in the scriptures, for most of it, now there is something that kind of links closely with what we would know to be leprosy, but the scribes say that they count around 72 different conditions that qualify as leprosy. So this is rashes, this is boils, this is blisters, like anything that looks unclean, you are now a leper. And so there was this idea of clean and unclean in the Old Testament, the temple period. And so this is more than just a skin condition. Because in the Old Testament, when someone came down with what we call leprosy, it was seen as divine punishment. Not only do you have a sickness, but the very hand of God's judgment is upon you. This is what this man is walking with and living with. They were required to dress a certain way, to identify with the entire public around them that right there, that is a leper. Do you see the way he's dressed? Don't touch him. They were required to stay at least 50 paces away from a clean person. 50 steps away from a clean person. They could not get that close to Jesus, let alone a regular law-abiding citizen of the Jewish nation. So there's a lot of dynamics that are happening here, but the leper in this story is actually breaking Jewish law by getting even close to Jesus. This would have gotten the attention of everyone around them or near them, but this leper in the middle of it, he senses desperation. He knows something is happening specifically with this rabbi named Jesus, although he more than likely doesn't know that he's the full Messiah yet, maybe has heard some things that are taking place, and he runs and he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. And he says this statement of faith that many will read as kind of like a weak prayer. But he's not praying weak. He says, I know that you can heal me if you will. He says it differently there, right? He says, if you will, you can make me clean. And so he's not giving Jesus this out like, I don't think you can do it, but maybe if you could, I don't know, but if you don't do it, I'm going to be fine. That's not what he's praying here. He's praying, Lord, I know that you can heal me, but it's if you will. Is it time for you to heal me? What do you think about the faith of this leper? Because I would imagine for us in the room, there's probably been many things that we've prayed for that we've not seen healing take place in our life or the lives of family members, and it's been hurtful. There's been this pain that is kind of in your heart of like, well, I trusted in God, I believed in God, I had faith that he was going to do it. I didn't doubt that he was going to do it, and all of a sudden it doesn't happen, and all of a sudden we get this like, well, see? And so we protect ourselves. Listen to the faith of the man. If you will, you can make me clean. Dave, I'm praying for your healing. And I believe that God is going to heal you. But even if he doesn't, I'm going to trust Jesus and his plan that he has for you. Amen? That's the faith that this leper was living with. I believe that you can heal me, but even if you don't, I'm going to be okay. Let's see how Jesus responds to this faith. Mark 1:41, he says, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and he touched them and he said to them, I will be clean. I will. So he had the will, and then he commands them, be clean. And Jesus was moved with pity. Now, when we think of pity, we think of like, Jesus was just like this sad, like, oh, poor guy. Like you see like a stray dog on the side of the road. I've seen people risk their lives to rescue a stray dog. Like, I will run across 45 at rush hour traffic because there's a dog. And I'm like, you're a human. Not that the dog doesn't matter, but I think your human life does too. Maybe we think of pity as like feeling sorry for something. Like you ever have trouble sleeping and you find yourself watching TV late at night and that commercial comes on of like the impoverished kids across the world. It's got the sad music. And you're like, oh, I can't watch it. Guess what never happens? No one ever gives to that. No one ever is like moved by pity in the sense like, you know what? I'm moving to Africa because I want to make a difference in their lives. It's easy to feel sorry for things, situations, is it not? But feeling sorry for situations does not always motivate us towards action and even kingdom action. And so pity here is more than just feeling sorry. Some transcripts actually say that Jesus was angry. Now, the translators didn't really like this term, this phrase of Jesus being angry, because it carries this connotation of like, oh, I don't know about that. I don't know about Jesus being angry because Jesus is perfect and he never sinned. But it wasn't like Jesus was walking around with this chip on his shoulder. But it really does capture what was happening here. Jesus was not angry at this leper for throwing himself at his feet. What Jesus was angry at, it was this righteous anger because of the plight of this human man that had to live in obscurity because of the leprosy that he carried. Think back for just a moment to what we just talked about with leprosy. To stay 50 steps away from anybody that is clean. To have to live in an outside community away from everybody that you know because you can't be in contact with anybody that doesn't have leprosy. And this man throws himself at the feet of Jesus, and the idea being this is never what the law was meant to be. The law was never to ostracize people. But it's where they found it, and Jesus sees this injustice of this man whose entire life has to live in the shadows of society, and righteous anger rises up in him, and he wants to make the wrong right. Now, we have to be careful here because in our culture, in the current climate that we have, this idea of justice and making wrongs right has taken on all new meaning that we've got to relearn because of the last 5 years of our culture and our world. As soon, I can almost guarantee you, if I was to preach a message on justice, we would receive emails. Are you guys one of those woke churches? Think about the absurdity of that. That we would see justice as a cultural war term rather than a kingdom term. We have to be careful. We have to be careful to not put our cultural catchphrases here. And Jesus turns to this leper who's kneeling at his feet. He sees the wrong. He says, "This is not the way. I am moved to pity. I am righteously angry because of it." James Edwards, scholar, says it this way: with Jesus, compassion replaces contempt. For everyone else in the culture, what is taking place? Oh, there's a leper. Hey, go to this side of the street. Kids, come over here. Why don't you walk on this side? Let's not get close to them. There's a contempt. And Jesus says, no. I have compassion on this human being who's desperate for a touch from the Lord. I'm not going to shove him to the side. I'm not going to rebuke him for breaking even the Jewish law as he just did. But I'm going to show him with compassion and mercy what the creator of the universe actually looks like. So I think if the goal for us as followers of Jesus is to be like Jesus, to love like Jesus, to act like Jesus, to the best of our ability through the power of the Spirit, not that you're going to be perfect, but if that is our goal, then I think the question becomes, how are we going to respond when we come into contact with people that don't fit the mold of what we think it should look like? How are we going to respond when somebody different than what we see as acceptable in our church culture walks through our doors? someone that doesn't look like you, someone that doesn't live like you, vote like you, or even love like you, how are we going to respond to people in situations like that? Or are we going to respond in contempt, or are we going to respond in compassion? We have to be careful to not let the things of the culture wars around us to shape who we are called to be as followers of Jesus. I'm not saying that culture doesn't matter. I'm not saying that politics doesn't matter. I am saying that we cannot allow that to shape us in how we interpret the scriptures and see the scriptures. Let's look at what Jesus does next. He's moved with pity, and then he stretches out his hand and he touches him, and he said, I will be clean. He touched him. I would imagine if you were in this city where Jesus is, and you were following a law-abiding Jewish man or woman, and you see Jesus touch this leper, there would have been an audible gasp in the air. How could he? Did you see it? Just touched him. Now they're in a real conundrum. Because here's the Messiah that is now ceremonially unclean. What are we going to do with this? Jesus is breaking these molds. He stoops down to the level of this leper, puts his hand on him, and knowing that he was going to be unclean to the eyes of the people around him. But Jesus, he's used to breaking cultural norms. It was worth it for him because he's looking at it from the lens of humanity, his creation, not through the lens of some law that has been added on from time to time. And he's saying, no, listen, this is my creation. I'm going to stoop down to his level. I'm going to touch him. Now, there's an old song we used to sing growing up in church titled, He Touched Me. One of my favorites. I'm not going to sing it. You don't want that. But he says, oh, he touched me, he touched me, he touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and he made me whole. Some of you are like, I can hear the Gaither singing it right now. If you ever wonder what it is like to be a pastor's kid growing up or a pastor's grandkid growing up, when we go to my grandparents' house, that's pretty much, it was either boxing, westerns, or Gaithers. That's it. That's all we got to watch. Yeah, that's right. So my theology is a little bit of John Wayne, a little bit of boxing, and a little bit of Gaithers. No, not really. It's different than that, please. Jesus is in the business of breaking cultural norms to reach the lost and the hurting. Should we, as followers of Jesus, not be in that same business? Breaking the cultural norms and saying, I'm going to go outside of the box here because this is what I sense Jesus would be doing, all to reach the lost. Are we willing to do it? I don't know. You know, Lindsay and I just spent the last week in the Bible Belt of Portland, Oregon, and we were sitting in churches that hold to a historic orthodoxy with even things regarding sexuality, which is like you just don't do that in Portland, right? Like you're not allowed to do that. They'll show up on your doorstep, and they will have whatever you call it. What do they call those things where they get people out there and they're chanting? What do they call that? Protest. There you go. My mind did not work there. And all the things, right? But we're sitting in these churches that hold to these historical orthodoxy beliefs of the Christian faith in the middle of pure chaos. And what they're seeing is that people are tired of seeing the emptiness of the world of progression and of no morality. They're tired of it. Because it's empty. There's nothing to it. In the end, pursue all the things that you want to in your life. Find all the freedom you want. But in the end, where does it get you? Nowhere. So are we willing to break the cultural norms? And I know, listen, I'm not a native bred Texan. I get that. I know it's like, I understand. I'm like half Texan now. At least my kids are. And but the reality is what we see in these other cities, culturally, it's going to happen here at some point. are we going to be willing to break the cultural norms and go reach the people that really need Jesus? 42. It says, and immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Immediately. Immediately. Kids, when your parents ask you to do something, what do you do it? When do you do it? Immediately. That's right. That's the right answer. So we were like, tomorrow? Mark is continually writing this phrase, immediately. It's in his, that's why I love Mark. He doesn't have any time to waste on extra words. He's like, and Jesus healed this person, and Jesus did that, and Jesus preached here. Boom, he was resurrected, and boom, that's it. That's the story of Mark. There's no process for this man. There was no 5 steps to get rid of leprosy. There was no biohacking. There was no Huberman podcast. There was none of those things. You know what it was? It was just Jesus. And this is not a slam to like all the things, right? Like you've probably seen the viral video of the guy washing his face with sparkling water and waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning this last week. All the things, right? It's dumb. Don't do it. Live your life for Jesus and your family, not for the gym. All right, great. Glad you could come to my TED Talk. Sorry, Will. We see this in the story of Jesus where people would push through the crowd, push through the cultural norms, reach out for Jesus, and he would touch them. You think about this, the woman with the issue of bleeding for years and years and years, who had seen every doctor that she spent her entire life savings just trying to find a fix to what was wrong with her. In a matter of a moment, from the touch of Jesus, she's healed. This leper who had been living in the shadows of society, full of shame and guilt and why me and what is God's hand upon me for? What is the reasoning that I'm here? And he throws himself to the feet of Jesus, and Jesus touches him, and it's done. R. Alan Cole says it this way: is when the compassionate Christ and the yearning sinner meet, there then comes instantaneous and complete cleaning. Now, some of you might read this story and you think, well, Derek, I don't have leprosy, so I'm good. I don't have a skin disease, and even if I did, not really culturally appropriate for our time today. We don't follow the Old Testament law. We're in the New Covenant, and I can kind of just check out on this entire message today. But the reality is that every single one of us in this room, you may not have some kind of physical leprosy, but every single one of us in this room do have a spiritual leprosy. We have a sickness that in our human nature lives inside of every one of us that causes us to be prone to wonder. I mean, think about this for a moment. As a follower of Jesus, we know what God has done for us. We know the fulfillment that we get in our relationship with him, yet we still find ourselves looking for other things that might satisfy us a little bit more. Do we not? We are prone to look and wander for these things. There's something that when we, the yearning sinners, run and we throw ourselves at the feet of Jesus, we don't find a judge with an iron gavel. We don't find one that is ready to throw a stone or to point a finger or to bring shame upon us. No, we find a merciful and a compassionate shepherd that stoops low to the level of the sinner and picks up their eyes and says, I want you to look at me. I will make you clean. This is the Messiah that we serve. That he doesn't judge us in the sense like, yes, one day there's going to be judgment, and yes, he's a God of righteousness and judgment and justice and all the things, but in the moment when we throw ourselves at his feet, no longer is there shame and guilt and how could you and what did you think about that, and I want you to ruminate on your own mistakes and your choices that you made. No, none of those things. He stoops and he says, you, son, daughter, you're clean. And when you have been met by this compassionate Christ, your life will never be the same. It's not that you won't struggle. It's not that you won't have issues from time to time. Anybody in the room have some issues? Yeah, all of us. We have issues. It's good for you to admit. But when we have this encounter with the compassionate Christ, we no longer do things out of duty. We no longer do things because we want to earn more of God's love or favor. We'll begin to see our desires, even in our own life, will begin to shift and change because of the work of the Spirit that is happening, of rejuvenating us and sanctification that is happening in our lives as we follow Jesus. We'll see a shift in our lives. Why? Because you've been touched by the Creator of the universe. Now, offer's still on the table for those that don't know him. Let's look at verse 43 and 44. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once. And he said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go. Show yourself to the priests and to offer for yourself cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. Such an interesting line. Could you imagine looking at this man that Jesus just healed and saying, I know that I just changed your life completely, but don't tell anybody. We can look at this story and we're like, how could this leper do that? He ruined Jesus' life. You don't think Jesus knew what was about to happen? This is the creator of the universe, the sovereign, almighty God. He understood what was about to happen. And so here's this man, gets his life changed, and Jesus says, listen, I want you to just kind of don't talk to anybody for a while. Just go to the priest. We'll just keep this on the down low. This would be like you winning the lottery. And I know that you're Christians and no one here plays the lottery. Unless that Powerball number gets really high, then everybody's like, I think I'm going to just give a shot. We see you at the gas station. Your life has been a leper. Your life has been a life of shame. You're seen as a visible representation of God's judgment. Your life's now changed, though, but don't tell anybody. The reason for this is Jesus is trying to protect his status as Messiah. It's not ready for his time. Jesus sends him to this priest. Now, the priests have some duties here. The duty of the priest was to declare if somebody was clean or unclean. And if they were unclean and they became clean, they had to go to the priest. They had to show themselves to the priest, and then the priest would say, hey, you are now officially clean. There's a process that would take place. First of all, they would have to bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons to the temple, and they would have to sacrifice the first one on the altar, and then they would take the second bird, and they would put the bird in the blood, and then they would let the second bird free. It was symbolic, saying, like, there's no more sin in the camp. There's a scapegoat, right? The sin has been placed on this one and has been taken away. And then after the birds, after a period of about 7 days, they would come back and they would sacrifice lambs now at the altar. This is the process of just simply to declare yourself clean. The good news for you and me is no longer does a human priest we have to go show ourselves to. There's no sacrifice that you have to make, but Jesus has become the sacrifice for you. This is the beauty of the gospel. This is the beauty of what he has done for you. Let's look at verse 45. Parents, I'm trying really hard to keep this one short with the kids in the room, just so you know. He says this, but he went out and he began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places. And people were coming to him from every quarter. This leper did not listen to Jesus. I want you to keep it quiet. Next verse. And he went out to tell everybody. Everybody has that one person in their family or their friend group that you're like, if you have a secret, don't tell them. Y'all have those people? Some of you are like, I don't know. You may be the person. I don't think the focus here, though, is on, it's not just on the disobedience of the leper, although that matters. Obedience matters to Jesus, yes. But there's a bigger story unfolding that I want us to see here. Here's the main idea for the entire message. is that Jesus frees the leper from his burden, but the leper puts the burden on Jesus. Jesus frees the leper from his burden. Think about this burden this leper had been carrying. Like, for most of his life, it doesn't tell us how long, but for as long as he's had leprosy, he's had to live outside of the city gates. He can't be around anybody that is clean. He has to dress a certain way so that the entire town can know that right there is a leper. Shame, burden, all the things. And Jesus, in one touch, frees him from his burden. But then the leper goes and he puts his burden on Jesus. This, my friends, is a picture of the gospel. This is a picture of the gospel. That soon, this is really what was happening. This was a foretasting of what was to come, is that soon Jesus, the Messiah, this leper was kneeling before, would soon go to the cross and become the one that would receive all the burden for the sin of the world, place it on his shoulders, go to the cross that we should have went to, die the death that we should have died, simply so that we could have a relationship with the Father, and no longer did it have to be sacrificed. There just had to be a simple yes and trust in who Jesus is. That is what this story is about. That Jesus would take the burden from this leper and free him from his burden, but also say, give me the burden. I've never meant for you to carry this. Now, I want you to think for a moment about your own sin and your own mistakes. Your own sin and your own mistakes. What happens when we find ourselves in sin, right? We hide in shame. Did you know that in our culture, shame is one of the most driving forces of why we have so much trauma inside of our own lives? We don't want people to see us for who we are. We don't want people to experience for who we really are. And so we hide in shame. And you know, the enemy loves it when Christians hide in shame. He loves it. And so we hide in shame, we hide in guilt, and we think, like, you know that cycle that plays over in your mind? I'm the worst person in the world. Why can't I just get it together? Who do you think that you are? How could you serve at church? You're filthy. All the things that replay in our mind when we mess up and when we make mistakes. Jesus kneels to the sinner and says, son, daughter, let me carry that for you. One of the pastors that we were with this last week, Joshua White, he said this, and maybe it was just something that I needed to hear. He says, on your worst day, Jesus is still madly in love with you. On your worst day, Jesus is still madly in love with you. He stoops down, lifts up the chin of the sinner, looks him in the eyes and say, there is nothing you can do to make me love you more. Nothing. And there's nothing you can do to make me love you less. And for the one that grew up in a legalistic mindset and household, you need to hear this. The gospel is not about a list of rules that we obey and we strive as much as we can just to try to obey to keep our life in order and structure. Yes, obedience matters. Yes, the way of God is important. But the gospel says you do it because you love Christ, not to earn more of his love. Here we find this leper that has thrown himself at the feet of Jesus. He's broken every Jewish law there is known to man right here. And Jesus doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't shame him. But he kneels down and he puts his hand on him and says, you are clean, my son. Look at the second half of verse 45. And to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. But he was out in desolate places and people were coming to him from every quarter. And as Jesus' popularity grows, we start to see this rhythm of ministry and rest and ministry and rest. Sometimes it's by design, sometimes it's by necessity. But Jesus finds himself in these desolate places. There's this rhythm that Jesus has to break away from the chaos of his life and to be with the Father for a moment. And I want to speak just the cultural moment that we find ourselves in. It bothers me a lot. And I know there's a balance here. I kind of hinted at earlier with this Ashton guy that's built in a lab. Waking up at 4 a.m. and all the things, right? I'm not saying discipline is unimportant, because I need more of it, obviously. But in our hustle culture that would say, unless you're working 24/7, you are not successful, you are setting yourself up for disaster. And that could be with yourself emotionally, but could also be with your family. It doesn't take long for us to watch our kids to see where we're putting our priorities, right? You ever see the little kid that's got the fake phone and they're like walking around talking on the phone, like, what are you doing? I'm like, Daddy. And you're like, I don't like that. I'm not saying don't work hard, but what I am saying is that if Jesus needed rest, I just have this weird feeling that you may need rest too. God gave us a Sabbath from day one, and because we live in like John Wayne culture, it's like, who needs rest? No, you need rest. Your body needs rest. Your mind needs rest. Your soul needs rest. Jesus out in the desolate places. This means solitary place, a wilderness, uninhabited place. Are you breaking away from the chaos of your life to be with the Father? But here's another angle to this story. It's not just that it's a place of rest, but that Jesus and the leper have now traded places. Jesus and the leper have now traded places. This leper who had to live in the wilderness, in the desolate place, Jesus touches him. And now the leper is free to live in the city, free to do what he wants to do. But now Jesus has to live in the desolate place. Can I tell you that this is the story of who Jesus is? This is his in his DNA. Is that Jesus has always been in the business of taking and trading places with us. He says, all that shame and guilt that you're carrying, would you give it to me? And I want you to find freedom. He traded places with the leper, and he trades places with you and me, because he's just that loving. I don't know about you, but I'm thankful that Jesus traded places with me. That he died the death that I should have died. That he bore the guilt and the shame and the sin that I should have been carrying. But he says, no, son, you're clean. Would you bow your heads with me this morning?